Welcome to the Short Funk Podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet, and today the civilian casualties associated with the airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. I've been following this for about 4 months now in order to record a short funk on this topic. Maybe once a month I'll go back and check the numbers to see what they are. But here's the numbers that we do know that are relatively uncontroversial. There have been 8,400 or so airstrikes in Syria and Iraq as of last week. Most of my numbers come from Shane Dixon Kavanagh's article of a week ago. It was syndicated in a few places. You can search out the article if you want. Up until this point, the analysis associated with civilian casualties in Iraq and Syria associated with the bombing had occurred through half a dozen independent websites, which I track periodically. And unfortunately, these websites don't have anything close to exact numbers. There are comments like dozens and multiple associated with civilian casualties. But rest assured, from what I can determine, on average, for each airstrike, there is at least 2 to 3 civilian casualties. This makes up for airstrikes which are uncontroversially no civilian casualties, also airstrikes where the civilian casualties are numbered as multiples or dozens. According to the Pentagon, there have been 6 civilian deaths, or actually, to use the Pentagon language, 6 civilians may have died in these attacks. That's 6 civilians total. I don't know if this number includes Kayla Mueller, who was the female hostage that died in an airstrike. But, yeah, the nature of these Pentagon numbers are pretty difficult to determine. They kind of have some hand-waving about one airstrike that might have killed 6 people. Very, very curious. The reporting through the first 3 days of the bombing was about 180 civilians had died through that. And that was relatively uncontroversial at the time. If you go back and read that now, the numbers have been reduced in the Syrian and Iraqi humanitarian organizations that have been actively tracking the airstrikes. But assuming my number of, say, 2 to 3, averaged over, you're still dealing with tens of thousands of people who have been killed through these airstrikes. What's particularly curious is up until the news story that I'm primarily quoting from, the accounts over, I don't know, maybe, let's say 6,000 of these airstrikes, even by Western observers, was remarkably low. And it looked suspiciously like any journalist that was willing to publish numbers of a reasonable level was going to be severely censured through the process. It was really very curious. In the Kavanaugh article, they quote an independent monitoring group without actually naming who the independent monitoring group is. However, this is a Western independent monitoring group. And they say maybe 680 to as high as 975 civilians have died in these 8,400 airstrikes. The Western monitoring groups have really unbelievably low numbers. And it's a point of concern that there seems to be such disparity between the reports of the folks on the ground who are actually collating these bombing strikes, killing civilians, and the Western independent monitoring groups, here one unnamed as such. The numbers just don't correlate in any way, shape or form. The independent Syrian and Iraqi monitoring groups paint a very compelling story. Most of their references also contain cell phone video footage, which is posted to YouTube, literally showing people going through the wreckage of these houses and identifying the dead. I only watched one of these videos. I'll talk a little bit more about these kind of videos in a later short funk. I have it slated. I've been working on it periodically. But what is particularly curious is how unidentifiable the human remains are. There was some footage initially associated, I think, with the first bombing of Raqqa, where a body looked more like a dog. I mean, it really had been sufficiently disfigured, dismembered, that it wasn't really recognizable as being human. And when you look at the kind of explosives that are used in these airstrikes, you realize that they are fundamentally what would be called in the military anti-personnel ordnance. They're just designed to basically decimate and clearly flood an open space with just a shockwave that basically kills people, dismembers people, this kind of stuff. It is astonishing that there's no actual reporting associated with the casualty count with these airstrikes. And as I've noted, the Western media seems almost complacent associated with the lack of reporting. It could be a sense that the Western population, particularly in the US and other countries that are participating in these airstrikes, don't really care about the civilian population in these areas. a lot of the rhetoric that you hear through this current political season in the US from both the Democrats and the Republicans seems to indicate that this is an issue where everyone should support the bombing of Syria. In fact, in terms of these candidates, everyone does support the bombing of Syria. There seems to be no independent analysis associated with the effects that this bombing has caused. So if we assume that 20,000 people have been killed in these airstrikes, which is roughly the number that I came to through analysis of various sites and lack of collation in certain areas, that is certainly a considerably smaller percentage of the population than has been killed, for example, by Assad, who mysteriously, through all these calculations, it seems to indicate that both the US-led bombing campaign and also the Russian-led bombing campaign is particularly careful not to target any of Assad's forces through this process. So while the civilian casualties remain remarkably high in terms of the independent monitoring groups on the ground, Assad's forces seem to be left unscathed through both the Russian and US-led bombing. Let us not forget what is going on currently. Let us keep in our minds that our humanitarian methods here might also be contributing to a substantial humanitarian disaster. Tom Barbalet in San Jose, signing out.